It soon comes round again after Christmas, 6 days into the new year, of what's known as the Epiphany. Last year I spoke to you about how the sort of story of the Nativity had got mixed up with the story of the Epiphany, and how Christians often have the wrong view of what actually happened, or rather the time scale in which it happened. This year I'd really like to just ask a question, and the question is this: what did, or rather what became of the gifts given to Christ by the Magi? We know what the gifts were, but we don't know how much of them there was, nor do we know exactly what happened to them. There are some limitations, and there are some sort of realistic pontifications, I suppose you could say, that we could put on this. We know that there was 3 gifts: gold, frankincense and myrrh. Now, frankincense and myrrh are scents, fragrances. So we presume that those would have been carried in jars. I mean, frankincense, you generally tend to, it's incense, you can burn it. Whereas myrrh is, I think, more of an oil. It's what they sort of anoint dead bodies with, I think. And obviously gold is, sort of like a lump of metal. These things were carried from a long way. And they were probably carried on camels. So, presuming each Magi had its own camel, they would only ever be able to bring as much as you could fit on a camel with them riding it. So these are unlikely to be staggeringly huge gifts. They're more likely to be sort of a pot of each, I suppose. So what happened to these gifts? Well, these gifts were intended for Christ, but at the age that Christ was when he was receiving them, he was sort of a toddler, so it was his parents that received the goods on his behalf. And shortly after the Magi left, King Herod began his slaying of little babies in order to try and kill the Christ, because he didn't exactly know where or when or who the Christ was, so he decided to kill them all. So Mary and Joseph had to leave and go to Egypt. Now, we know they had the means for travel because they travelled to and from Bethlehem and to and from Jerusalem at the temple. So we know they had the means to the transportation. We also know that at that point in time, both Israel and Egypt were under Roman occupation. So it would be a little bit like sort of movement within the within the European Union. I mean, you could just sort of walk across the border. So there was no particular, there should have been no particular sort of payment for actually fleeing. But I suspect there was payment once they got into Egypt. Simply put, they would have had to start their life in Egypt afresh. Joseph obviously had his trade, and as a carpenter, that would be a sort of trade that could happen anywhere. So he would be able to easily get an income. But I'm not sure how well hidden they needed to be in Egypt so that they weren't discovered, I suppose, by Herod until he died. I suspect they spent the cost of those gifts in living in Egypt for several years before returning home. Though that's of course complete guesswork. There is another alternative, and that is that because these things were dedicated to Jesus, it's quite possible that Mary and Joseph would have given them to the temple as offerings. It doesn't explicitly say what happened to them. I mean, the other possibility is, of course, they could have saved them for Jesus to use at his own sort of convenience as he was older. But again, his travels were rather more funded at a grassroots level, sort of locally, and you never hear of big extravagant. There was nothing that he needed to really spend it on. So it remains a little bit of a mystery, but I thought that would be quite an interesting thing to sort of bring up and sort of talk about, Mary, this particular Epiphany. So if you haven't, it is now the 6th of January, and you should take down your decorations, although the Feast of Christmas in fact continues and for 40 days, so we've got another sort of nearly 27 odd days left of it. But it's traditional to take down your Christmas decorations now, so so there we are. This is my Epiphany broadcast for this year.